On this channel, we explore the potential of the individual. But in order to do this, we must shift our focus back and forth between the inner and the outer worlds, which are often direct reflections of one another. Now, it's easy for modern people to reject depth psychology completely. As we discussed in episode 1, looking through the narrow lens of materialism makes most important truths completely invisible. This is why so many people are still steeped in the hopeless battle between conservatives and liberals. The battle is hopeless. Why? Because it is literally a battle against one's shadow. This is not flowery language. Quite literally, it is a battle against one's shadow. Now, to win this battle, we would have to eliminate one side of reality. And put another way, we would have to eliminate our own shadow, that which we are not, that which we are not aware of yet. So obviously that's not possible. That's not going to happen. So for some of you, this information will be quite familiar. For others, it may connect some dots that you haven't connected before. And for those with hatred toward either the left or right political party, you're probably going to hate this video even more. Let's do it. Now, just to repeat what has been said time and time again on this channel, the reason we talk about the political divide so much is because politics are not really about politics, especially not anymore. They are about shadow, and they are about what is being embodied by the individuals in particular groups. So imagine if you took a person, a very integrated, very wise, very mature adult, someone who's functioning like a true adult. If you took that person, theoretically, and split them down the middle and took them in two halves, and you had those two sides of them now operating independently, this is essentially what we're looking at in the political spectrum. We're looking at people who are split down the middle and they've lost the other half, or they're not in touch with the other half, so they are running around and really doubling down on this one mode of being, this one ideology, this one way of believing, this one way of understanding, and they're just taking that and running with it. And as they double down and triple down on that mode of existing, they become more and more polarized from their shadow, what they are not conscious of. And of course, as we know in psychology, that gets, it gets rejected, obviously, and then it gets projected onto other groups. Not just any group, right? There's a science to this. So it gets projected onto the group that embodies that shadow, right? So this is exactly what we're seeing happen in the political sphere, and it's why understanding this from a depth psychology perspective holds literally the key to the advancement of people in the Western world. People are either going to advance forward and grow, or they're going to regress and regress and regress and regress. And we're already seeing a lot of that regression now because of this adamant rejection of the shadow. So let's talk about what that actually looks like. I'll give you some examples, and we'll see exactly how that shadow rejection is playing out in real time. To start, we have to address the context in which all of this is taking place. So as we've talked about in episode 1 of this series, the materialist framework for understanding reality, right? that is the context in which this whole battle between left and right is playing out. Taking this through a materialist lens, there is, first of all, no awareness that the shadow exists. Even if there is awareness, it is rejected as false. The shadow doesn't exist. Projection is, I think projection is understood to exist, but for some reason, everyone still seems to ignore it. It's like, even if these very intelligent, mind intelligent people are aware that projection exists, they are not aware at all of when they are engaging in it, right? That's the big thing with projection. It's like we may have a population that believes that projection happens, but it's always happening with other people, right? Other people are always projecting, and we never seem to get around to figuring out when we are projecting. So it's kind of not a useful concept if we can't really engage with it. Okay, that's the first thing. We've got this materialist structure going on. Second thing, this is especially true in liberal culture, where we're really big on the rejection of the masculine and feminine right now. It's a huge thing, because this is a whole other video, so I won't go deeply into it, but there's this whole misconception that to acknowledge the reality of masculine and feminine is somehow to like limit one's freedom, or to oppress others, or to discriminate against certain types of people. Of course, this is not at all the case. What we're actually seeing is, so in the Western world, we have an arrogance problem at the same time as a naivety problem. So we have lots of extremely naive people who've had very, very little contact with their shadow. Because as soon as you get in contact with your shadow, you become very humble, and sometimes a little too humble, because you realize how much you actually don't know, and it's kind of frightening. So, but when you're not interacting with that, it's very easy to be very, very overly confident in all these mental constructs that we have, this materialist structure. So we've got high confidence, I would even say arrogance, and then we have low awareness. So there's a lot of ignorance and a lot of confidence going on at the same time, which is a really bad pairing. So anyway, back to what I was saying. I see this especially in liberal cultures, where there's this rejection of masculine and feminine, because again, when we're looking at masculine and feminine through a materialist lens, right? Everything is on the surface, nothing has deeper meaning, everything's cut up and fragmented, so we don't really understand the context, the depth of it. We equate masculine and feminine with gender norms. And we think that that's what people are talking about when they're talking about masculine and feminine. There's an assumption that we're talking about gender norms from the 1950s, and that's not at all what we're talking about. Although I think gender norms from the 1950s kind of pulled from the reality of masculine and feminine forces. When I said that we were dealing with a lot of arrogance and a lot of ignorance at the same time, when we reject the reality of masculine and feminine, we're basically taking ourselves out of nature and all that has ever existed over time, right? All through ancient history, all different cultures, all different religious and spiritual movements, all people have kind of always acknowledged in some sense that they were a part of nature, that they were a part of, that they had a biology, that they just like came from nature. Like, I don't know how else to say it. Like, we're just a part of it. We're just animals in a sense, like all other animals. So to acknowledge that basic reality is actually to acknowledge the existence of masculine and feminine energies. And the easiest way to conceptualize this, as I talk about a lot on this channel, is through yin and yang, right? is these ancient teachings that have been around a really long time, and many, many, many people have studied them and developed it further. And so that is what we're going off of here when we talk about masculine and feminine. We're talking about the qualities that tend to make up the yang side of life, and all of its manifestations in nature, right? In animals and plants and humans and everything. And then the yin side of life and all of its manifestations all throughout time and nature. So this is a very vast thing that we in the Western world, to pick on liberals for a moment, liberals in particular are trying to divorce themselves from that history, from that like earth-based like reality of like, this is what I am a part of. Again, because they're equating it with discrimination and rigid gender roles, which it doesn't have to be a part of that at all, right? That was more of a conservative construct and a conservative interpretation of these polarities, right? So we don't have to understand it in an oppressive way at all. So why am I going into this? Well, to get started with this topic, I have to first convince you that masculine and feminine forces exist, and that we're not talking about sexism or like gender discrimination or anything like that. So we have to start there. I have to convince you that that exists to some extent, which hopefully I've done a little bit, maybe. Maybe you still don't believe me. Whatever. Moving on. So, when we acknowledge that these two forces exist, we then can see in very specific ways how the political spectrum is rooted in those two forces. And we've taken it, and like everything else, we've kind of oversimplified, and we've watered it down to this very rigid separation. But again, if we zoom out and look at the context, we're talking about yin and yang, which has always existed. It's always been happening. And the political divide is a very narrow, rigid manifestation of those two forces. Now, what the hell does that mean? What is that? Why even bother talking about this in the context of practical day-to-day life? As we start to pay attention to these two groups and the types of things they say to one another and the types of things they believe and the types of things, specifically, most importantly, the types of things that repel each of them, we can see in very granular detail how this is playing out. Starting with conservative culture as an example. Keeping in mind, we can talk about conservative individuals who are not political, right? We can talk about more liberal-minded individuals, even if they are not politically involved at all. So again, we're talking about the being, the way of being, the way of believing, the way of thinking and seeing the world, which usually, in my experience, people usually sway one way or the other. I do and have always swayed more feminine in my interpretation of reality. And you'll see that through this work. So starting with the conservative realm, a lot of this has always been quite evident to me, even if I couldn't put it into words, and that is because whichever side you lean toward, you can always easily see the shadow of the other side. So that is another big rule here, is that it's easy to see the shadow of the other side, the ones that you are not. So let's just start with the conservative side of things. When we're talking about conservative, the conservative shadow, basically what conservatives do not know about reality, we're talking about the feminine realm. That is what they do not know about reality, right? They're very aware of the masculine realm, and you'll see this reflected in almost all of their belief systems. For example, they are extremely freedom oriented, so that's pro-individual. The individual is masculine, whereas community is feminine. So they're very pro-individual, they're very pro-freedom of the individual. They're very pro-responsibility, as we've talked about, personal responsibility. In my video, The Psychology of Victim Blaming, we talk about why more conservative-minded people do not like, they are triggered by the reality of victimhood. So when they see victims, they have a reaction to that. Say something bad happens to someone and it's on the news, they have a sort of triggered reaction because conservatives are triggered by the reality of victimhood, that victimhood is a part of life. Why is this triggering? Because it is the idea that you are not in control of everything, right? Some things happen to you that are not your fault. And so the thing with that is, why is that so scary? Well, it means you're out of control in some sense, right? People who are conservative-minded like to live in the realm of personal responsibility because it feels empowering, right? It feels empowering to say, I am in control, and if something happened, it's just because I did something wrong. I made a mistake. And that helps me avoid victimhood, right? So conservative culture generally never wants to touch in on that victimhood. And so it's kind of like a lot of people in conservative culture have a very, very neglected inner child. I would say much more so than in liberal culture. Liberals are like often pretty aware of the inner child in some capacity. They're more aware of their feelings. They are obviously more aware of how they've been victimized. And this serves as a trigger to conservatives because conservatives do not want to engage with their own victimhood in their lives. I also did a video on what does Make America Great Again really mean, where I talked about conservative culture's big trope, which is basically suppression, emotional suppression. So when you have a masculine culture, it's almost inevitable that there's going to be the suppression of emotion, because what we're suppressing is everything yin, everything dark. So we're, adamantly in resistance to our own shadow. Other shadows, we just consider it all bad because it's murky, it's confusing. More masculine people do not do well with the shadow. And again, all of this stuff is connected. So I also have a video on what are they called? Like those I forget what they're called. Pickup artist guys, and why they need a strategy for meeting women. Again, we're talking about more masculine minded people who function more masculinely. So they need a strategy for getting close with women because they are so utterly detached from their own feminine that they don't understand what it must be like, and so they can't relate on any real grounded level with a woman, right? So we see a lot of that in these conservative-minded people needing these logical strategies to try to engage with people who are more feminine. But hopefully this isn't too confusing. I know I'm just throwing ideas out, but I want you to see like all the different common manifestations of this. So let's quickly look at the liberal side of things and talk about some of the manifestations there. And again, once you start looking for these things, you will be able to see them in day-to-day interactions with people on each of these sides. So you'll know what they think before they say it. You'll know how they feel before they say it. You'll know what decisions they're going to make and what's going to trigger them. It's very down to a science. And okay, so let me stop there and let's look at some liberal shadow pieces here. So again, equal, opposite, right? It's like we split a person in half and they have two opposite modes of being now. So when we take the liberal half, we're getting all of the other things, right? We're getting the opposite of independence, which is community. We're getting the opposite of personal responsibility, which is looking to your environment for causes of anything, problems in particular. This is why liberals are all about reform of the culture, right? Reforming the culture, looking at environment such as parental upbringing, social structures, institutions, the education system, you name it, government, everything. Why? Because we are split off, right, from our personal responsibility. So we are triggered by personal responsibility, just like conservatives are triggered by victimhood and how they're not in control. Liberals are triggered by the exact opposite. They are triggered by personal responsibility, and they are extremely comfortable in the realm of finding other factors for why things happen to them, right? So yeah, this can easily be seen as a negative thing. I can kind of see where a lot of people are probably thinking, oh, that's just bad. Like, you can't take personal responsibility. Like, you're a child. And yes, it is childlike, but it's equally childlike to not be able to engage with your own vulnerability, right? Victimhood is another word for vulnerability. So we have the conservatives can't engage with their vulnerability at all. That's kind of a big deal too, right? Because there's no self-nurturing. It's like an environment of self-abuse, right? So again, with the liberals, we have this situation where you can have a lot of great social reformer types who recognize a lot of problems in the culture. You might see this a lot in my own work, always talking about problems in the culture. Liberals are kind of experts in this, and not experts on the personal responsibility piece, because it feels threatening, it feels triggering. Another this fascinates me to no end, another fascinating aspect of liberal culture is the attempt to remove objective reality. Like, holy shit, this is this is like big news. This is like a cultural event, right? We've never had a group, in my awareness, we've never had a group try to eliminate objective reality. Like, what a creative idea, and also an absolutely horrible idea at the same time, right? What am I talking about? Okay, so again, conservatives are obsessed with objective reality, right? They're often hyper materialists. They don't, they can be dogmatic and very religious, but that's a sort of materialist religion, right? It's very literal. It's like, Jesus died for your sins and you better repent and you shouldn't be gay and blah, 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 right? It's the masculine version of spirituality, kind of. So conservatives are all about objective reality. 2 + 2 is 4. If you say it's 5, like, you've lost all credibility among conservatives, right? That's objective reality. It's what we can all agree on. Like, I knock on my desk right now. My desk is here. It's a piece of wood. That's what I know is true. What's right in front of my face, right? Objective reality. Liberals being that they are more feminine beings on average, are they kind of feel put in a box by objective reality, right? So it's kind of like if you had an artist and you told the artist you're only allowed to create let's say you had a painter and you said you're only allowed to paint things that exist in the room, right? You're only allowed to paint your desk, your chair, your whatever, your bookshelf. That would be really boring for a creative, more feminine-minded being, because they don't want to operate within the realm of objectivity, because there's so much more happening in the imagination. And we could argue that all innovation and all creation of new things comes from the imagination, right? So liberals are interested in what? Subjective reality. Subjective reality is highly interpretable, right? It's the opposite of objective. It's everyone's interpretation is different. This is where the whole identity explosion has come from. The whole gender identity explosion right now has come from this preference, strong preference for subjective reality. And subjective reality is creative, right? It's me sort of artistically creating reality. Again, this is fine. This is a great way to be in a lot of ways, but we're seeing it taken to the extreme, of course, as we're seeing everything nowadays taken to the extreme. And we're seeing a rejection of an objective reality, a rejection of what has objectively, unarguably happened thus far for humanity. So biology is a part of that. We don't want to, on the liberal side of things, we don't want to think about or engage with anything that is considered objective, because it's a trigger, right? Same as with the conservatives, subjective is a trigger. It's stupid, it's fluffy, it's meaningless. It's like, why are you engaging with that stuff? It's so dumb, it's not even real, right? That's the conservative perspective of subjective reality. Hopefully this isn't too confusing. With the liberals, we have the same exact thing of objective reality. So objective reality now doesn't exist. It doesn't matter. And being that we're living in a very materialist, and even beyond materialist, we're living in very like concrete lives, you know? We're not like angels up in the sky. We are human beings. There's gravity. We're stuck on Earth, at least for now. And so denying objective reality is, again, such a fascinating and creative thing to do. But it just can't work out. It just can't be. When we try to get rid of objective reality, it ends up very destructive. We become extremely delusional. Think about it practically. If each individual is operating in their own subjective reality, then nothing is agreed upon, right? It's like, well, I'm floating in space right now. And it's like, okay, that guy over there, he's an astronaut, right? That girl over there, she's whatever. She's a tree, you know? And it's like, okay, I mean, that's great. It's great to be creative. It's great to engage in your own subjective reality. Part of this is identifying oneself and one's values. Again, very important to do that. But when we try to, again, eliminate objective reality, it's funny because liberals are actually kicking themselves, and this community that they want to create, they're actually alienating everyone who doesn't have the same exact subjective reality as they do. So it's funny, and you'll see this in both ideologies. Both ideologies destroy what they attempt to create, right? So this, giving the liberal example again, if everything is about subjective reality, we've actually eliminated the chances of forming a community. Because a community can only be built upon agreement between different people, right? So if there is no agreement and everything is subjective, we can't live in communities. We can't accomplish a task or a goal. We can't do anything at all. We've gone too far down the rabbit hole of the subjective. It's kind of like if someone were to take acid every single day of their life, what would what would happen? They would spend their entire existence in the realm of the subjective, and they would probably forget to eat food, and they wouldn't go to work, and so they would end up homeless, and it just wouldn't practically work out, right? And you'll see, not to keep harping on this one point, but it's just the most interesting thing, the contradictions that arise when liberals try to get rid of objective reality, they contradict themselves so many times. It's you know, it's like specifically with the gender things, it's like, okay, masculine and feminine doesn't exist, but I am this gender, and it's like, but I thought they didn't exist. It's like there are so many examples of that when you watch them explaining themselves. It's contradiction after contradiction, and their friend's reality technically conflicts with their reality, but because they don't need any objective agreement, it becomes nonsensical. So why does this matter from a psychological perspective? Why do individuals need to know this information? One, it's very good to place yourself on this spectrum. You should know where you fall on this masculine-feminine spectrum. It is okay if you are skewed quite a bit from one to the other, but just be aware that if you are skewed quite a bit feminine or quite a bit masculine, you're going to generally have a bigger blind spot. At least that's what I've kind of noticed in people. And then as you develop yourself and integrate more truths into yourself that you have at your disposal, what will happen, I think, this is just my opinion, what will happen is you will come to center, right? You will no longer be able to identify with liberalism or conservatism, because it is just so easily, you can so easily see how dramatically skewed it is that it's impossible to really exist inside of that box anymore once you become more conscious and more embodied of all aspects of yourself. So what I notice a lot in very feminine skewed people, especially young women, I've noticed, is there's not a lot of masculine embodiment. So there is a struggle with, I guess you could say, naivety. There's a struggle with logic. There's sort of a lack of backbone. I think Clarissa Pinkola Estes talks about this in the Women Who Run with Wolves. She calls it women's lost instinct. It's kind of like that. I see this a lot in younger women who haven't yet developed that masculine, or worse, they were trained out of it. Unfortunately, that can be as well. A lack of discernment is a good way to put it. So it really doesn't benefit anyone to be quite heavily leaning and skewed in one direction and very oblivious to the opposite way of being. it basically signals a lack of development in that opposite aspect, whether it's masculine or feminine. And when you don't have that development, you encounter problems for sure, especially in today's Western world, which I would say is more masculine driven. It really hurts, possibly worse, to not have that masculine development, because it's sort of like the one that we respect the most. This is another theory of mine. Not having that feminine development, I think, is manifesting as men going their own way, and like men's rights activists, basically very, very bitter men who hate women. Again, this is another example of rejecting your shadow. You hate the opposite, right? You hate what's in shadow because you consider it other, you consider it not me, and in making that mistake, you become blind to all the ways that you are that. That's a big thing. That's a big problem in relationships. So we're seeing these men who hate women because maybe they dated quite a few women who they didn't understand. Maybe those women were also quite immature, and so there was a lot of damage. There was a lot of wounding, and they just kept othering and othering and othering and othering. You'll see this in the political divide as well. The polarization stretches and stretches and stretches because everybody keeps othering. That's not me. I'm not like that. That's bad. It's bad. It's bad. It's bad. It's bad. And the distance grows and grows and grows. And then the shadow projection gets more ridiculous. So, for example, this men's rights movement, men who hate women on the internet, and they like to talk about it. A big thing you'll see in their culture is what we would consider negative feminine behavior. When you reject your shadow, aka you're a man, you reject the feminine, you reject women who you've dated, you hate it, blah blah blah. You're rejecting the other, what you consider the other, and so you then have empowered your shadow to become more ridiculous and more of that thing. Let me say that again. When you're rejecting the other, you then give your shadow more power to become more of that thing in a shadowy and negative way. So, as I was just saying, in a lot of these men's groups, I notice a lot of what we would call like dark feminine behavior. They love to manipulate women. That's a big thing they like to talk about. Manipulation could be considered dark feminine behavior, right? That's like a yin, like witchy thing to do. But you'll see it very prominent in the men's rights groups and like the pickup artists people, because they're rejecting and heavily embodying their own dark feminine whatever. Whereas if they had just accepted that it's not other, and that is in them too, they would have learned to understand women, embrace more of their feminine side, and they would have come into balance. They would have been able to relate to women better, probably find a nice girl, and be more of themselves, most importantly, right? So that's an interesting piece that no one seems to know in all of these groups. No one seems to know that on the other side of all this hatred and rejection of the shadow is just balance, calm, ease, understanding, mutual respect for different types of people, right? Liberals are so obsessed with this diversity piece. Well, the key to accepting other types of people who are not like you is to integrate your shadow. And then you would not be discriminatory or biased, right? And so to explain how people are supposed to develop themselves in these ways, it's kind of hard because it's a very natural, organic process. I think it's a natural side effect of being open and interested in learning. When you are wide open and interested in learning, and you are not super defensive and like clinging to this ego, you naturally become aware of these things and you develop in these different ways. This is my big dream for humanity, which is probably like never ever gonna happen, but theoretically, this is how I believe that the political two-party system will be completely abolished if all individuals were on board for this process. And again, all this process is just learning, maturing, developing as an adult, developing yourself as an individual, being open to your blind spots. That's all this is. It's just natural development. If all individuals were open to this natural development process that would take place, I believe quite firmly that we would abolish the two-party system. There would be no need for cults or cliques anymore, because there would be no polarization of the masculine and feminine psyche within the Western individual. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you know someone who would be interested in this type of conversation, please share this video with them. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Follow me on Instagram, subscribe to the newsletter, yada yada, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you.